Virtualization is one of the hottest areas in IT today, and there's so many different aspects of it. You could be talking about network virtualization. You could be talking about client or desktop virtualization like we are, server virtualization, security virtualization. There's so much we can do today with virtualization technology. Our focus is on client side, is on taking like a Windows machine and giving that Windows machine the ability to run Linux inside it so that we can practice with Linux. What a great idea. In fact, we'll do just that. Now, before you run and try and virtualize your system, you may want to take a breath for a moment and see if you can run the hypervisor. And that's the fancy word we use or term that describes the virtualization software. There's two different types of hypervisors, by the way. And no, you don't need to know this for the exam, but I want you to know it for you personally. There is a type 1 hypervisor and there is a type 2. A type 1 hypervisor installs on what we call bare metal. That means there is no operating system that needs to be there. It can install right on the hardware and allow you to start virtualizing. A type 2, which will be our focus in this nugget, is when you have a guest operating system and then we install in there the type 2 hypervisor as an application, and then we can install the new operating system in there. This is frowned upon compared to type 1, I guess, because you need the bloatware, you need all that big operating system in place to be able to do it. But for our purposes, a type 2 would be just fine. Now, what do these things require? Well, they require a lot of CPU and RAM in order to work real well. So look at this. We have a 4-core processor. That's great. That's awesome. This means that we can take one or two of these cores and dedicate it to virtualization on this particular system. Now, another concern would be RAM. How much RAM do we have? Because we're going to virtualize the RAM. We have 16 gig of RAM. Well, that's great. I could have Windows getting 8, and then I could have the new operating system I install getting 8. Now, Microsoft gives you a virtualization platform. It's called Hyper-V. And if we go down to the bottom here, it says, okay, Hyper-V is all set, except virtualization isn't enabled in the firmware. Yeah, in the BIOS, we would have to go in and say, all right, let's turn on the virtualization capability for this device. So, interesting that there's virtualization software that would allow us to, let's say, run Linux on this Windows box built right in. Let me show you where you would go to get this. We won't use Hyper-V. In Control Panel, you would go to Programs and Features, and you would turn Windows features on or off. So this little box comes up, and if we scroll, let's see, to the H's, there's Hyper-V, and we could install the Hyper-V management tools, and this would obviously not be grayed out if we had the BIOS set for virtualization. So set your BIOS to enable virtualization, and then you could install these two components that make up Hyper-V. Now, sure enough, it's not just Hyper-V that would require virtualization to be enabled for us to do client-side virtualization on this Windows machine. So I did restart. I hit delete during startup, and then I went into the BIOS and I turned on virtualization capabilities because VMware Workstation 12 Player would require that as well. I did a Google search, by the way, for VMware Workstation 12 Player download, and that's where I found this free download from VMware. Great. And in here, what we're going to do is say create a new virtual machine. I went and grabbed from Ubuntu the latest Linux Ubuntu. It is free of charge. It is an ISO image for making DVDs, but we're not going to use it that way. We don't need a DVD. We're just going to say there is an installer disk image, an ISO that we want to use. The VMware Workstation detects that it's Ubuntu 64-bit, so it will do an easy install. What this means is it will literally do it for us. We don't have to sit there and do the installation. It's like a Windows unattended installation, if you will. Now, in my nugget where I install Windows in a similar fashion, I choose this option that will do it later if you wanted to step through all of the steps of installation. But for our purposes, the easy install will be great. We'll say next, and there are security settings here for us to complete. Remember, just because this is a virtual image does not mean that we can forego security. We want to follow the security guidelines of our organization with strong passwords and things like that, because this thing could do damage to our network. I mean, it is a full-blown, fully functional Linux, so we want to watch out for that. Notice it'll get a machine name of Ubuntu 64-bit. That's great. It'll be located in my virtual machines directory. That's wonderful. And we have very little disk space to spare, so I'll just give it a 5 gig disk split into multiple files. We can preview the settings that it will receive, and I will say, don't power it on right now, and then finish. To modify the settings of this virtual machine after the fact, you just go into Edit Virtual Machine Settings. We see they recommend just 1 gig of memory for this very efficient Ubuntu. Just one processor. There's our 5 gig hard disk that I gave. Something else that's really interesting is the network adapter settings. By default, it will use NAT, sharing this host's IP address, getting internet access just like our host does, and the host here refers to the Windows operating system that's hosting things. Notice we could set up a particular virtual network interface card and give it parameters if we wanted to. We could bridge a connection to a physical network. So lots of exciting options when it comes to the network adapters, the virtual network adapters capabilities. All these things are great, so we'll just say okay, and what we'll do is we'll play the virtual machine, and that will kick off the Ubuntu automated installation for us. Now that would kill my ability to record on this system, so I'll just go ahead and press play, let the installation run through, and then we'll come back and see the result together. So I pressed play, the virtual machine ran, went through the unattended installation, and then I just logged in to my Ubuntu desktop. You can see there's software updates waiting for me. We can see that this machine is going to have connectivity to the internet just fine. Why is that? Well, because it is sharing through network address translation the address that is assigned to the host operating system, Windows in this case. And now we have this great platform that we can practice Linux with. So I encourage you to follow along with this process and have fun with it. And let's just go through the blueprint items, though, kind of as a checklist to make sure we know what CompTIA wants us to know in this particular area. What's the purpose of virtual machines? Well, what wouldn't their purpose be? I mean, we could certainly build a VM to learn like we're doing. We could build a VM to test. We could build a VM to use as our operating system. Keep that in mind. So really, the sky is the limit when it comes to the virtual machines. Anything you would use a physical box for these days, we could turn to a virtual machine for. Resource requirements, we said we want to have that multi-core CPU. We want plenty of RAM. From an emulator requirement, we saw where we might have to go into the BIOS and enable virtualization. If you don't have this feature in your BIOS, as some like tablets wouldn't have the virtualization capability, then you're out of luck when it comes to what the emulator needs. From a security perspective, we have to remember that this is an entity on our network and can do damage just like any other host entity. And we know that we take our physical network adapter, and inside the virtual machine, there's a virtual network adapter, and that's how it's making connectivity to the world through our physical NIC. And finally, we know it's the hypervisor software that makes this possible. We went one step beyond what the test would ask you about, and from a real-world perspective, you know there is a Type 1 and a Type 2 hypervisor. We tend to prefer Type 1s, but in this demonstration, we went with a Type 2 hypervisor. So in this hands-on lab nugget, we took a look at client-side virtualization. Now, would in the exam CompTIA have you do a performance-based simulation where you install a virtual machine? Well, you know, think about it. What would they choose for a hypervisor? I mean, there's the workstation player, there's Hyper-V, there's a Citrix solution. There's just so many potential solutions out there. That one might be a little bit tricky, but it's certainly game, and that's why we did a hands-on lab nugget, and that's why you're practicing this and having fun with this. Well, I sure hope you found this nugget informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.